Published in Germany in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican monk and inquisitor, the Malleus Maleficarum, or in the English tongue, Hammer of the Witches, stands as one of the most infamous and influential treatises on witchcraft in the annals of European history. Crafted during the Renaissance and coinciding with the advent of the printing press, this book profoundly shaped the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. It methodically outlines the existence, practices, and prosecution methods of witchcraft, predominantly targeting women, whom it claims are particularly susceptible to diabolical influences. Despite its eventual condemnation by the Church, the widespread distribution and enduring impact of the Malleus Maleficarum fueled centuries of witch hunts, resulting in the torture and execution of thousands. Today, the work remains a crucial point of study for those seeking to understand the cultural and intellectual underpinnings of one of the darkest chapters in our history. Hello everyone and welcome. Well, today we're talking about something particularly interesting, the old Malleus Maleficarum. As always, leave something insightful in the comments. If I find it particularly interesting, I will pin it up the top and everybody can see. And also check us out on Facebook. We're building a community up there, slowly but surely. Well, let's get on with the topic for today. Nice and relaxed as usual. The opposition from the Church to witchcraft and heresy has deep historical roots, as reflected in the Canon Episcopi, which was issued around 900 AD, declaring that witchcraft and magic were nothing more than diabolical illusions. Those who believed in such practices were seen as being misled by the devil through their dreams and strange visions. Despite this official condemnation, belief in the supernatural interventions persisted on, particularly through ordeals, which were later adapted for use in witch trials. Official church doctrine acknowledged that devils could be expelled through sacramental exorcisms, which of course continue even to our modern day, which recognized, of course, the Malleus Maleficarum as one of the 5 methods to counter the attacks. But unlike exorcism, the practices of prayer and transubstantiation were, of course, not regarded as magical rituals. In 1484, a clergyman by the name of Heinrich Kramer made one of the earliest attempts to prosecute individuals accused of witchcraft around the Tyrol region. However, his efforts were unsuccessful, and they even led to his expulsion from Innsbruck and dismissal by the local bishop, who described him as senile and insane. It's been suggested that Kramer's motivation for writing the Malleus Maleficarum was to vindicate himself and even in some way exact revenge. Other scholars argue that Kramer's primary goal in writing the book was to articulate his views on witchcraft, systematically refute those who denied its existence, discredit the skeptics, and emphasize that witchcraft was mainly practiced by women. He also had the aim of persuading magistrates to adopt his methods for identifying and, of course, prosecuting witches. I will get to the specifics of that later on. Well, after the rough time in Tyrol, all of his failed attempts, some scholars suggest that Kramer sought direct papal approval to continue his prosecutions against witches. This led to the issuance of the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus by Pope Innocent VIII in 1484. This papal bull empowered the Inquisition to prosecute cases of witchcraft and specifically authorized Kramer, along with the Dominican friar Jacob Sprenger. Now, on to Sprenger. Contrary to the belief that he collaborated with Kramer, some academics argue that Sprenger was actually a consistent critic of him, even going as far to prohibit him from preaching and banning him from Dominican convents under Sprenger's control. There is one Wolfgang Behringer, a modern historian who supports this view. He suggests that Sprenger was not a co-author of the Malleus Maleficarum as is once perceived, and that his relationship with Kramer was somewhat adversarial rather than cooperative. As stated by Wolfgang Behringer, and I quote, Sprenger had tried to suppress Kramer's activities in every possible way. He forbade the convents of his province to host him. He forbade Kramer to preach, and he even tried to interfere directly in the affairs of Kramer's Celestat convent. The same day, Sprenger became successor to Jacob Strubach as provincial superior, October 19, 1487. He obtained permission from his general, Joachino Turiani, to lash out against Master Heinrich Kramer, Inquisitor. Now, the preface also has purported a unanimous approval from the Faculty of Theology at the University of Cologne. However, numerous historians have contended that there is strong evidence from other sources, other than the Malleus, that the theology faculty of the university condemned the book due to its unethical methods and its contradiction of key principles of Catholic theology. Additionally, it is alleged that institutores deceitfully fabricated a document to falsely claim unanimous approval. The book served as the authoritative guide for secular courts across Renaissance Europe, but the Inquisition refused to acknowledge the Malleus's authority, and they did not utilize it. Now, prior to the year 1400, it was very uncommon for anyone to face legal action for practicing what was perceived as witchcraft. However, the growing prevalence of prosecuting individuals for heresy, combined with the inability to completely eradicate these heretics, set the stage for future criminal prosecutions. During the 15th century, the belief in witches had become extensively acknowledged and accepted in European society. In the past, individuals found guilty of practicing witchcraft usually faced relatively mild punishments, such as public humiliations like being placed in the stocks. However, their prosecution became increasingly severe after the Maleficarum was published, as belief in witchcraft became widely acknowledged as a genuine and a perilous occurrence, a threat to everyone. The most stringent prosecutions occurred from 1560 to 1630, and at least in Europe, they mostly ceased by 1780, with a few sporadic occurrences here and there, but not for much long after. Of course, the witch trials in the New World provinces, Massachusetts, all the rest, well, we'll get to them in a different video. Demonologists, and there were quite a few of them, all throughout Europe were obsessed with a fervent dispute about the nature of witches during the 16th and 17th centuries. As a result, they issued numerous printed sermons, books, and pamphlets. The Catholic Church exerted significant influence in creating the discourse on demonology, while the Reformation had quite minimal impact upon it. Of course, Martin Luther firmly believed in the existence and malevolence of witches, and played his own role in advancing Protestant demonology. But nothing is as extensive as the Catholic writings on it. It's quite fascinating. I do recommend you go and read some of the Catholic demonology. They really put a lot of effort into it. Now, both Catholic and Protestant demonologies shared similar fundamental views on witches, and most authors concurred on the gravity of the offense of witchcraft. The acceptance of witch hunting was evident in both Catholic and Protestant legislatures, as it was backed by governments of both religious denominations. You see, witches were considered enemies to Christianity, and witchcraft was seen as a most severe offense and transgression against God. In continental and Roman law, witchcraft was considered the crimen exceptum, a heinous crime that surpassed all regular judicial proceedings. During the Age of Enlightenment, the belief in the ability of witches to cause damage started to diminish in Western societies. Post-Enlightenment Christians held this belief because of their adherence to reason and empiricism. Now, onto the actual work itself. It's split up into 5 different sections, and we're going to talk about them one by one, provide some quotes from the book and some analysis upon them. So let's talk about the first section, being named Justification. This section provides a concise explanation of how the widespread use of sorcery, which is a strategy employed by the devil in his ultimate attack on God's creation, served as a motivation for authors to compose the Malleus Maleficarum. And this is a quote from the work. Lucifer attacks through these heresies at the time in particular, when the evening of the world declines towards its setting and the evil of men swells up, since he knows, in great anger, as John bears witness in the book of Apocalypse 12:12, that he has little time remaining. Hence, he has also caused a certain unusual heretical perversity to grow up in the land of the Lord. A heresy, I say, of sorceresses, since it is designed by the particular sex over which he is known to have power. In the midst of these evils, we inquisitors, Jacobus Sprenger, together with the very dear associate inquisitoris delegated by the Apostolic See for the extermination of so destructive a heresy, we will bring everything to the desired conclusion, naming the treatise Hammer for Sorceresses. We are undertaking the task of compiling the work for an associate. The second section is regarding the papal bull. The Malleus Maleficarum indicates a replica of a papal bull called Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, which is directed towards Heinrich Institutoris and Jacob Sprenger. Pope Innocent VIII admits that the existence and malevolence of sorceresses are indeed a problem, and recognizes their involvement in satanic activities. Based on the date of the document, the papal bull was issued in 1484, which was 2 years prior to the completion of the final Malleus Maleficarum. Thus, it does not signify support for a particular definitive version of the Malleus. However, its inclusion indirectly validates the handbook by offering overall affirmation of the existence of witchcraft and complete authorization to Sprenger and Institutores in their teachings and actions. And this is from the text itself regarding the papal bull. And they shall also have full and entire liberty to propound and preach to the faithful word of God, as often as it shall seem to them fitting and proper, in each and all of their parish churches and the said provinces, and to do all things necessary and suitable under the aforesaid circumstance, and likewise freely and fully carry them out. From the papal bull, Summis Desiderantes Affectibus. Now the next section is approbation. The section of the Maleficarum referred to as the approbation of the following treatise and the signatures thereunto to the doctors to the illustrious University of Cologne follows in the form of a public document. It consists of unanimous endorsements of the Malleus Maleficarum by all the doctors of the theological faculty of the University of Cologne, who have personally signed it. The proceedings are certified by Notary Public Arnold Kolich of Euskirchen, who is a sworn clergyman of Cologne. The confirmation of this testimony is provided by present witnesses Johannes Volder of Melchen, a sworn beadle, Nicholas Cooper de Vanraff, the sworn notary of Curia of Cologne, and Christian Vincent of Euskirchen, a clergyman of the Diocese of Cologne. The text of the approbation states that during the proceedings, Institutores, who do remember that that is the Latinized name of Heinrich Kramer, don't get confused, received a letter from Maximilian, who had recently been crowned King of the Romans and was the son of Emperor Frederick III. We're, of course, talking about the Holy Roman Empire here. Now, the letter is summarized in the approbation as follows. Maximilian I provides full protection to these inquisitors, and orders and commands all subjects of the Roman Empire to offer their support and assistance to the inquisitors. They are also instructed to act in accordance with the instructions contained in the letter. It is reported that in early December 1486, Kramer traveled to Brussels, the capital of Burgundy, with the intention of obtaining a privilege from the future emperor. Kramer did not have the courage, apparently, to involve Frederick III, whom he had previously offended. But once the new guy was in power, it wasn't so awkward anymore. However, this response he received must have been quite unfavorable anyway, as it could not be included in the foreword. Now, the approbation has a preamble and is subsequently accompanied by a decision divided into two sections. So let's first do the first part of the preamble. The text commences with a broad assertion of the prevailing conditions, which is written like this. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, Amen. Let all those who will read, see, or hear the present public document know that in the year since the birth of our Lord, 1487, in the 5th indiction, on Saturday, the 19th day of May, at 5 in the afternoon or thereabouts, in the 3rd year of the pontificate of our Lord, the most holy Father in Christ, Lord Innocent the Eighth, by divine providence Pope, in the presence of my notary public, and a witness written below, had been specifically summoned and asked for this purpose. the venerable and religious brother Heinricus Institutoris, professor of holy theology, and member of the order of preachers, who was appointed as inquisitor into heretical depravity by the Holy See along with his colleague, the venerable and religious brother Jacobus Sprenger, and also a professor of holy theology and prior of the convent of preachers in Cologne. Signatories express their dissatisfaction with certain religious leaders who boldly deny the existence of sorceresses in their sermons. They point out that the authors of the Malleus Maleficarum are not primarily focused on dispelling this ignorance, but rather on providing detailed instructions for sentencing and punishing sorceresses in accordance with religious texts and regulations. These signatories then clarify their motivation for sharing their expertise. And this is from the signatories. It is consonant with reason that those things that are done on behalf of the common good should also be confirmed through the common approval of the doctors, and therefore, lest the aforementioned poorly educated curates and preachers think, in their ignorance of Holy Scripture, that the aforesaid treatise which was composed in the manner mentioned above is poorly supported by the determinations and pronouncement of the doctors, they offered it for examination and comparison against Scripture to the illustrious University of Cologne, or rather to certain professors of holy theology, in order that if any things were found to be worthy of censure or incompatible with the Catholic truth, they should be refuted by the judgment of those professors, and that those things found to be compatible with the Catholic truth should be approved. Now, this was, in fact, done in the ways written below. So the next section is resolution. There are two signings, which are occasionally referred to as two approbations. The distinction lies in the fact that in the first part, 4 signatories confirm that they have scrutinized the treatises and support its content, whereas in the second part, signatories do not claim to have read the treatises, but still demonstrate approval by explicitly reiterating certain overarching principles of the treatises and endorsing them. The initial section presents the viewpoint of Lambertus de Monte of Herrenberg, who serves as the temporary dean of the Faculty of Holy Theology at Cologne. Subsequently, Professors Jacobus Strehlen of Notlink, Andreas Schermer of Oceanfurt, and Master Thomas de Scotia provide testimony affirming their agreement with his perspective. Now here is a portion of the opinion. I proclaim that this 3-part treatise, which has been examined by me carefully and compared against Scripture with regard to its first 2 parts, contains nothing, in my humble opinion, that is contrary to the pronouncements of the non-erroneous philosophers, or against the truth of the holy Catholic and Apostolic faith, or against the determinations of the doctors approved or admitted by the Holy Church, and that the 3rd part should certainly be upheld and approved in regard to the punishments of those heretics whom it reads. In it does not contradict holy canons, and also because the personal experiences described in this treatise, which are believed to be true because of the reputation of such great men, particularly since they are inquisitors. It should be ensured that this treatise will become known to learned and zealous men, who will then, on the basis of it, provide various healthy and appropriate advice for the extermination of sorceresses. Now, the second section is endorsed by the original signatories, as well as by many professors from Cologne. The signatories affirm that 1. The Masters of Holy Theology written below commend the inquisitors into heretical depravity appointed by the authority of the Apostolic See, in conformity with the canons, and argue that they think it right to carry out their office zealously. 2. The proposition that acts of sorcery can happen with God's permission through sorcerers or sorceresses when the devil works with them is not contrary to the Catholic faith, but consonant with the statements of Holy Scripture. Indeed, according to the pronouncements of the holy doctors, it is necessary to admit that such acts can sometimes happen. 3. It is therefore erroneous to preach that acts of sorcery cannot happen, because in this way preachers impede to the extent that they can the pious work of the inquisitors, to the prejudice of the salvation of souls. Nonetheless, secrets that are heard at any time by inquisitors should not be revealed to anyone. And 4. All princes and Catholics should be urged to think it right to insist such pious vows on the part of the inquisitors in defense of the holy Catholic faith. End of the affirmations of the signatories of the College of Cologne. Now, what about witchcraft itself? How is it actually defined by the Malleus Maleficarum? Well, according to the text, it requires 3 essential components: the malevolent intents of the witch, the assistance of the devil, and the consent of God. The treatise is organized into 3 distinct portions. The initial segment is targeted towards clergy and endeavors to counter arguments made by detractors who reject the existence of witchcraft in all its forms, thereby, of course, impeding its legal pursuit. I mean, you can't charge someone for something that isn't real, right? Well, the second section delineates the tangible manifestations of witchcraft and the corresponding methods of counteraction. The primary objective of the third division is to provide support to judges, there being secular judges, by the way, in dealing with and countering witchcraft, as well as to alleviate the strain placed on inquisitors. Each of the 3 sections explores the predominant issues of the nature of witchcraft and the identification of witches. Section 1 explores the theoretical aspect of witchcraft, analyzing it from the perspective of natural philosophy and theology. More precisely, it explores the inquiry into the authenticity of witchcraft as either an actual occurrence or simply a figment of one's imagination. Do remember, it was the Renaissance. People were certainly becoming a little bit more enlightened, albeit slowly, but, give them time. Well, it potentially describes this as deceptive apparitions created by the devil, or merely the products of excessive, agitated human thoughts. Too much time on their hands, that kind of thing. Now, the inference made is that the existence of witchcraft is actually supported by the existence of the devil, cannot have one without the other, and it's believed that witches had made a bargain with Satan to gain the ability to carry out damaging magical actions in the mortal realm. hence establishing a crucial connection between witches and the devil. The discussion in general within the text revolves around practical matters and real-life cases, as well as the abilities of witches and their methods of recruiting. The statement asserts that witches, rather than the devil, are mostly responsible for recruitment, bringing other people into the covens, They achieve this by causing misfortune in the life of a respected woman, which prompts her to seek the guidance of a witch. Alternatively, they may introduce young girls to alluring young devils. This text provides a comprehensive explanation of the methods employed by witches to perform spells, as well as offering potential countermeasures to thwart witchcraft or aid individuals who have fallen victim to its effects. But who gives them the authority to speak on such things? Well, they seem to have been quite versed in the theology of the day. They weren't just a random layman writing a book. In fact, Jacob Sprenger, he held the position of an appointed inquisitor for the Rhineland, serving as theology professor, and was a dean at the University of Cologne in Germany, while Heinrich Kramer, or once again his Latin name, Institutoris, held the position of an appointed inquisitor in South Germany. He was also a professor of theology at the University of Salzburg, and was widely recognized as the foremost expert in demonology and witch hunting during the late medieval period in Germany. In the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, Pope Innocent VIII addresses them, being Sprenger and Kramer, as beloved sons and professors of theology. Additionally, he grants them the authority to do as they will to eradicate witchcraft. Now, Kramer and Sprenger were the first to raise harmful sorcery to the criminal status of heresy. In fact, a lot of this was justified by the principles outlined in Exodus 22:18. That being, you must not allow a sorceress to live, depending on the translation. Well, that seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Back it up, boys. No arguments there. Well, if harmful sorcery is a crime on the order of heresy, Kramer and Sprenger argue, then the secular judges who prosecute it must do so with the same vigor that the Inquisition would in prosecuting a heretic. The Malleus urges them to adopt torture, leading questions, and the admission of denunciation as valid evidence. And of course, any other inquisitorial practices to achieve swift results. I'm sure it'll be a fair trial. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. Well, moreover, the authors insist that the death penalty for convicted witches is the only sure remedy against witchcraft. They maintain that the lesser penalty of banishment, as prescribed in earlier works like the Canon Episcopi, for those convicted of harmful sorcery, does not apply to these new breed of witches, whose unprecedented evil justifies capital punishment. The initial portion of the book's primary material employs the scholastic technique of Thomas Aquinas, which is distinguished by a style of debating questions particularly exemplified by his work Summa Theologica. It was a commonly used method of argumentation in scholarly discussions with a lengthy history. In fact, the majority of the citations in the Malleus Maleficarum are derived from various works attributed to Thomas Aquinas. Now, Aquinas is, well, he's a well-known figure. I've made a video on him, quite fascinating, you can go and watch it. And indeed, you'll find him as the primary reference for the first section of the Maleficarum, and you'll find him peppered about pretty much every other section too. Formicarius by Johannes Nieder is also a significant source for section 2, and Directorium Inquisitorum by Spanish Inquisitor Nicholas Emmerich is also a vital source for section 3. Of course, the Malleus advocated for the use of both torture and deception to extract confessions. It suggested that the judge, along with other devout individuals, should attempt to convince the prisoner to confess voluntarily, and if they wouldn't, you just convince them harder, and keep convincing them until they do confess. See where this is going? However, if the suspect refuses to confess, the judge orders the attendants to restrain the prisoner using the strappado and other torture devices. Now, if you don't know what the strappado is, that's probably for the best. But basically, you have your hands tied behind your back, and then a rope is tied around your wrists. And then they pretty much jerk you up by this rope, and your shoulders dislocate and all of your bones crack, and they just thrash you around for a while. Think about it when you pull a fish out of the water. It's kind of like that, except with your hands bound and your joints creaking and not good. Moving on from that. I'm sorry for that explanation of that, but hey, it's relevant to the text, so we have to know. Well, of course, faced with this sort of outcome, the attendants promptly comply, sometimes with simulated agitation. Subsequently, under the request of certain individuals in attendance, the captive is released once more and is separated from the group, and then once again convinced to admit guilt under the false impression that doing so would spare their life. Well, all confessions obtained through the use of torture, of course, had to be verified, and this is what it says about that in the text. It should be noted that if an individual confesses while being subjected to torture, they must subsequently be taken to a different location in order to corroborate and certify that their confession was not solely a result of physical coercion. Nevertheless, in the absence of confirmation, the act of torture could not be replicated. However, it was permitted to persist on a designated day, with the condition that if the prisoner fails to satisfactorily confess to the truth, alternate forms of torture must be presented to him, or her, rather, along with the declaration that unless a confession is made, they will have to endure these further tortures too. However, even if the method fails to instill fear and elicit the truth, then the following day or the day after should be scheduled for a continuation of the tortures, not a repetition, as it should only be performed if new evidence is presented. Next, the judge must formally inform the inmates of the following statement. We, the judge, etc., have scheduled a specific day for the resumption of the tortures so that you may speak the truth and have the entire process documented by the notary. Well, traditionally, witches were predominantly of the female gender, and following the release of the Malleus Maleficarum, it appears that 75% of individuals who were accused and tried as witches were indeed women. Of course, they were seen to have less faith and be more focused on physical desires than men. But there's something a little deeper, and it's just my opinion. I'm not sure if it's one of the reasons, but I think that the prevailing theory behind this goes back to that in the original Garden of Eden story, that Adam was not tempted by the serpent, but Eve was the one who ate the apple, getting that eternal knowledge and all that. So, I think that's where most of it comes from. That opinion that women were more susceptible to the wiles of the devil than men were. Well, the primary explanation, at least by the Malleus, was the fundamental principle of sorcery, which is the rejection of faith. Now, according to this belief, women are considered inherently bad due to their tendency to doubt in matters of faith more readily. So basically, they're talking about critical thinking. While it was possible for men to be witches or sorcerers, whatever we're going to use as a terminology, they were generally regarded to be less common, and the underlying factors contributing to their classification as witches were distinct as well. You see, the prominent type of male witch described in the book is the sorcerer archer. The book is somewhat ambiguous about this, but it does suggest that the motivation behind male witches is mostly driven by a thirst for power, rather than an unbelief or lust, which is claimed to be the case with most female witches. Now, undoubtedly, the title of the Malleus Maleficarum itself is feminine, suggesting that it was the women who were portrayed as the wrongdoers. Ultimately, it might take the form of Malleus Maleficorum, which is the masculine version of the Latin noun maleficus or malefica, meaning witch. In Latin, the term maleficarum is exclusively used for women, although the title maleficorum can be used for males alone, or as a kind of gender-neutral group pronoun when they are all together. The Maleficarum alleges that witches also engaged in infanticide, cannibalism, and the casting of malevolent spells to damage their adversaries, while also possessing the ability to emasculate men. Perhaps that's where all this comes from. Subsequently, it provides narratives of witches engaging in these illegal activities. Kramer and Sprenger develop a powerful, sex-specific theory of witchcraft based on a hierarchical and dualistic view of the world. You see, everything exists in pairs of opposites. God and Satan, Adam and Eve, or men and women. You see, each positive principle in a pair is delineated by its negative polar opposite. Perfection is defined not as the integration or preservation of opposites, but rather the extermination of the negative element in a polar pair. Because women are the negative counterpart to men as seen by the theology written within the Maleficarum, they corrupt male perfection through witchcraft, and therefore the women who engage in such activities are indeed witches and must be dealt with as soon as possible, and by the most horrible means. So, according to the Malleus, The only way a woman can avoid succumbing to her passions and becoming a witch is to embrace a life of devout chastity in a religious retreat. Go off and become a nun somewhere, basically. But the monastic life is actually quite reserved to the spiritually gifted few. You can just show up out of nowhere. People often think this is how you get into a Shaolin monastery or something like that. Just show up and become the thing. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Therefore, most women are doomed to become witches who cannot be redeemed, and the only recourse open to the authorities is to ferret out and exterminate as many of them as they can. Bad luck for them, I suppose. Well, the Malleus Maleficarum presents a distinct understanding of witches, known as the new category, Strixology, which significantly deviates from previously held beliefs. Kind of like a version 2.0 for studying witches. Of course, we had witches before then, but this time they had narrowed everything down into what they actually were and how to deal with them. Now, the term malefica possesses a distinct denunciation that is not present in other terms used to describe women with supernatural abilities. The perception of witches and magic, by extension, is inherently associated with malevolence, evil. It deviates from these previous notions of witchcraft that were more broad and encompassing, and just slaps a big label on everyone. Now, at this time, witchcraft formed a distinct and opposing religious belief. Once again, those polar opposites. The witch's once formidable authority over the deities was relinquished, as her capacity to compel their compliance was superseded by complete submission to the devil. Simply put, the witch transformed into a mere instrument of Satan, not some powerful being, just a tool of the devil. This portrayal of witches was a component of perception of magic that scholars referred to as Satanism or diabolism. According to this belief, a witch was a participant in an evil organization led by Satan and committed to doing harmful acts of sorcery on others. Now, in terms of the acts themselves, we can pretty much put them down to 6 specific activities. And it goes like this. First is aerial flight for the purpose of attending meetings with the devil, which is quite convenient, I will say. An assembly presided over by Satan himself and the attendants thereof, at which the initiates entered into the pact, and incest and promiscuous sexual acts were engaged in by the attendees. Also the practice of maleficent magic, sexual relations with the devil himself. A pact entered into the devil, specifically blood pacts, these kind of things, a concomitant apostasy from Christianity, and probably the worst one, the slaughter of babies, which is not good in any context. Of course, demons play a key role in the Malleus, as they are responsible for enticing humans to engage in magic and are central actors in the witch's pledges. They engage in sexual interactions with the witches on a regular basis. According to the book, it asserts that customary for all witches to engage in these depraved acts with demons. Quoting from the book, this activity constitutes a significant aspect of human-demon interaction, with demons engaging in it not for the purpose of pleasure, but rather with the intention of causing corruption. Now, it's important to mention that not all devils and demons engage in such activities. According to the book, it's a little bit more complex than that. Certain demons are reluctant to engage in certain behaviors and immoral deeds due to the nobility of their character. Credit where it's due, I suppose. While the work did not explicitly provide a roster or categorization of demons, as found in certain demonological writings or spell books from that time period, such as the Liber Juratus, it does actually make mention of several varieties of demons. For instance, the book extensively covers topics related to incubi and succubi, including their involvement in pregnancies, the subjection of witches to incubi, and the methods of defense against them. Now, with that, we've spoken enough about the Malleus Maleficarum. Of course, there's plenty of things to learn from the primary text itself. I'll probably do a full reading of it, because why not? But what do you think about it? Do you think the witches are real? Do you have salt lamps and crystals in your house? Tell me in the comments. For now, though, we're all going to have a nice rest and think about what we've learned. The Salem Witch Trials, conducted from February 1692 to May 1693 in colonial Massachusetts, stand as one of the most notorious episodes of mass hysteria in the history of America. Initiated in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, the trials began when young girls, including Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, exhibited convulsions and other unexplainable symptoms, which local clergyman John Hale described as beyond natural disease. These events were quickly attributed to witchcraft, leading to widespread panic and accusations among the small community. A special court of oyer and terminer was set up, employing questionable practices, such as the use of spectral evidence and a presumption of guilt, leading to the execution of 19 people and several others who died in custody. Eventually, the trials subsided due to growing skepticism about their validity and fairness, leading the colony to finally admit their mistakes and compensate the affected families. The witch trials of Salem have since become a symbol of the dangers of isolationism, religious extremism, and failures in judicial process, continuing to fascinate and serve as a cautionary tale nearly 3 centuries later. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Today we're going back to the early days of the colonies in Massachusetts, the New World, quite removed from the Enlightenment of Europe at the time, where superstition was primed to run rampant. As always, I'm going to pin the top comment. Do you have something to say about the witch trials? Perhaps you're still a little bit annoyed by them. Or tell me your thoughts in the comments, and I'll pin the most insightful one. But for now, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can begin. We go back to February of the year 1692, where in Salem village one 9-year-old Betty Parris and her cousin Abigail Williams, 11 years old at the time, the daughter and niece respectively of Reverend Samuel Parris, started experiencing strange fits that were described by the minister of the nearby town of Beverly, John Hale, as beyond the capacity of normal epilepsy or even natural disease to cause. According to Reverend Deodat Lawson, a previous minister of Salem village, the girls exhibited behaviors such as screaming, throwing objects, making unusual sounds, hiding beneath the furniture, and contorting themselves into unusual positions. Well, the girls expressed their dissatisfaction at experiencing pinches and pricks caused by pins, but no physical proof of any sickness could be found by a doctor. Well, the doctor believed to be examining them was one William Griggs, a local of the village, the best that they had on hand. Subsequently, other adolescent girls in the village started to display conduct that was somewhat similar. During Lawson's sermon as a guest in the Salem village meeting house, he was frequently interrupted by the outbursts of these afflicted individuals. Well, the initial individuals, accused and apprehended for purportedly causing harm to Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., and Elizabeth Hubbard, were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. According to several historians, the charge that was made by Ann Putnam Jr. indicates that a dispute was there inside a family that may have been a significant factor contributing to the witch trials. Nothing gets fingers pointing like family grievances. Well, during that period, there was also an intense and hostile competition, between the Putnam and Porter families, which caused a strong division among the residents of Salem. Politics at the family level. Citizens frequently engaged in intense disputes that would evolve into full-blown conflicts, primarily driven by their differing opinions on the rivalry. It was red team versus blue team. Think about a Romeo and Juliet sort of thing, the feuding families. Somewhat similar, except with significantly less romance. Well, several of the bodily signs had similarities to convulsive ergo intoxication, as suggested nearly 3 centuries later, but we will get to all of those specific causes towards the end of the video. Now, on to Sarah Good. She was a poverty-stricken woman, not much to her name, and she was accused of witchcraft based on her reputation. You see, during her trial, she faced allegations of deviating from Puritan principles of self-restraint and order by deliberately tormenting and ridiculing children instead of guiding them towards spiritual redemption. Well, Sarah Osborne was infrequently present at church gatherings, and that raised a few red flags of its own. You see, Osborne was charged with witchcraft due to the Puritans' belief that she prioritized her own personal interests after marrying an indentured servant. The townspeople expressed their disapproval of her attempts to exert control over her son's wealth from her former marriage, too. Now, on to the third. That was Tituba, a Kalina lady from the West Indies who was enslaved in South America, was likely singled out due to her ethnic dissimilarity from the majority of the people. She was charged with enticing youngsters, such as Abigail Williams and Betty Paris, by recounting tales of sorcery from the Malleus Maleficarum. I have a video on that too. It's basically a guide on how to spot, hunt, and prosecute witches. Quite interesting. Well, these stories of sexual encounters with demons, manipulation of men's thoughts, and fortune-telling were believed to provoke the imaginations of young girls, making Tituba an easy target for allegations. Well, each of these ladies was marginalized and displayed numerous characteristics commonly associated with those who are often accused of witchcraft, and unfortunately, they were left to fend completely for themselves. Summoned before the regional magistrates due to the allegations of practicing witchcraft, they underwent extensive questioning processes lasting multiple days, commencing on March the 1st, 1692, before being formally incarcerated. In March, several individuals were implicated in witchcraft allegations. Martha Corey, young Dorothy Good, and Rebecca Nurse in Salem Village, as well as Rachel Clinton in the neighboring town of Ipswich. Martha Corey's doubts regarding the reliability of the girl's charges had attracted attention. The community was extremely upset by the claims against Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, because both women were fully committed members of the church in Salem Village and Salem Town, respectively. The villagers believed that if individuals of high moral character could be witches, then that means that anyone could be a witch, and being a member of the church did not provide immunity from being accused. You can see where all this is going, right? Well, let's continue on. Dorothy Good, who was the daughter of Sarah Good, while being a mere 4 years old, was not spared from interrogation by the magistrates. Her responses were interpreted as an admission that incriminated her mother. Rachel Clinton was apprehended for practicing witchcraft in Ipswich around the end of March, on separate charges that were not connected to the sufferings experienced by the girls in Salem Village. The early tests involved conducting physical assessments on the accused individuals to identify distinctive bodily features, such as moles and birthmarks, which were frequently considered to be indicative of the devil's influence. It was believed that such symbols symbolized the devil consuming blood from the accused women. Now, Sarah Cloyce, who was the sister of Nurse, and Elizabeth Proctor, also known as Elizabeth Bassett, were apprehended in April and then presented before John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin at the gathering in Salem Town. Both men served as local magistrates, but were also members of the Governor's Council. The examination was attended by Deputy Governor Thomas Daneforth, as well as assistants Samuel Sewell, Samuel Appleton, James Russell, and Isaac Addington. Elizabeth's husband, John Proctor, was arrested that day due to his objections during the hearings. But of course one can hardly blame him. Your wife gets arrested on trumped-up charges of being a witch. Well, you can definitely be quite angry about that one. Certainly act as a character reference at least, albeit a little biased. Well, within a span of 7 days, Giles Corey, who was Martha's spouse and a member of the church in Salem Town, together with Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs, were apprehended and subjected to questioning. Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs were all admitted guilty and started identifying more individuals as collaborators. Whether this was under torture, well, that's for the courts to decide. Additional arrests ensued, including Sarah Wilde's William Hobbs. That's right, it wasn't all just women. That was the spouse of Deliverance Hobbs and the parent of Abigail. Also, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., along with Mary Easty, the sibling of Cloyce and Nurse, Edward Bishop Jr. and his spouse Sarah Bishop, and finally Mary English. All arrested, dragged away kicking and screaming for questioning. Reverend George Burroughs, Lydia Dustin, Susanna Martin, Dorcas Hoare, Sarah Morey, and Philip English, who was Mary's spouse, were apprehended on April 30th. Nehemiah Abbott Jr. was released due to the consensus that among accusers, that he was not the individual responsible for the hauntings that they had experienced. Mary Easty was temporarily released following her original arrest due to the accuser's inability to definitively identify her as the one responsible for afflicting them. However, she was then detained again when the accusers simply changed their minds. It's not very fair, isn't it? In May, an influx of accusations persisted. However, certain individuals among the suspects started to elude capture. John Willard and Elizabeth Colson were detained after many warrants were obtained. However, George Jacobs Jr. and Daniel Andrews evaded capture. Up until now, all the actions taken were for the purpose of gathering information. However, on May 27, 1692, William Phipps issued a command to create a special court of oyer and terminer for Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties. This court was tasked with prosecuting the individuals who were currently imprisoned. Additionally, individuals were also issued new warrants. Sarah Osborne, one of the initial 3 individuals charged, unfortunately passed away in custody on May the 10th, 1692. You can probably imagine that conditions were not the best in the prisons. Now, another 36 warrants were issued for individuals as examinations continued in Salem Village. The individuals included Sarah Dustin, Anne Sears, Bethia Carter Sr., and her daughter, Bethia Carter Jr., along with George Jacobs Sr. and his granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs, John Willard, Alice Parker, Anne Predator, Abigail Soames, and George Jacobs Jr., the son of George Jacobs Sr. and the father of Margaret Jacobs, along with many others. Well, by the end of May, when the court of oyer and terminer assembled, there was a total of 62 individuals in detention awaiting their fate. Cotton Mather corresponded with John Richards, a fellow member of his congregation and a judge, on May 31st, 1692. In his letter, he expressed his endorsement of the prosecutions, but also advised Richards to use prudence. And here we have an excerpt from his letter. The correspondence from Cotton Mather with John Richards, and he wrote, "Do not lay more stress on pure spectral evidence than it will bear. It is very certain that the devils have sometimes represented the shapes of persons not only innocent, but also very virtuous. Though I believe that the just God, and then ordinarily provides a way for the speedy vindication of the persons thus abused. And so, with that, the court of Oyer and Terminer was assembled in Salem town, June the 2nd, 1692, with William Stoughton, the recently appointed lieutenant governor, serving as the chief magistrate. Thomas Newton acted as the Crown's attorney, responsible for prosecuting the cases, while Stephen Sewell served as the clerk. The grand jury was presented with Bridget Bishop's case first, and they approved all the charges against her. Bishop was characterized as deviating from the Puritan lifestyle, if you can call it a lifestyle, due to her choice of black attire and unconventional clothing, which was contrary to the Puritan rule. During her pre-trial examination, Bishop was questioned about her coat, of all things, which had been inexpertly severed and ripped in 2 different manners. So the jury concluded that she was indeed a witch, based on her immoral lifestyle. She was immediately brought to trial and found guilty on the same day. Rebecca Nurse and John Willard were indicted by a grand jury on the 3rd of June, but their trial did not start immediately due to circumstances that to this day remain a little unclear. Either way, Bishop met her demise through the method of hanging on the 10th of June, 1692. Rest in peace. Now, after the first execution took place during the Salem Witch Trials, the court paused proceedings for 20 days to seek counsel from influential ministers in New England. On the 15th of June, a response was received, authored once again by Cotton Mather. The ministers expressed deep concern for the afflicted individuals, but they also praised the government's efforts to uncover this malevolent witchcraft and urged caution in further persecutions. They warned against relying solely on spectral evidence or superficial signs, noting that such evidence could be manipulated by the devil. Ooh. Well, they advocated for careful and discreet investigations, stressing the importance of protecting the reputations of those accused. But despite these cautions, they supported the continued prosecution of those who were justly suspected of witchcraft according to the laws of God and England. Now, a little off track here, but as far as I'm concerned, that is an accusation that never goes away, even if you are found innocent. Now you imagine it, if you're hauled off on the charge of witchcraft, kicking and screaming, being dragged out by the guards or the police force, whatever it is. Everyone in the village looking out their windows thinking, they got another one. Well, if you come back and you say, well, they found me innocent, a lot of people are still going to be a little bit cautious around you. You see, perhaps it is so that the devil was so powerful within you that you were so gifted with a silver tongue to talk your way out of things. People who believe very strongly will find any way to put the guilt on you. So be very careful with that one. And that's just, well, human nature, I'm afraid. Well, heading back to the topic at hand, according to Thomas Hutchinson, the letter's initial and last portions weakened the impact of the other sections, resulting in increased intensity in the prosecutions. And When Cotton Mather republished the letter in the Magnalia years later, he omitted that 2 first and last sections. Now, Major Nathaniel Saltonstall resigned from the court around June 16th, and this was perhaps due to his dissatisfaction with the letter itself, which did not explicitly prohibit the use of spectral evidence. Salstall, according to Upham, should be credited for being the sole public figure of his time who possessed wisdom and bravery to denounce the actions from the very beginning. Perhaps so, or perhaps the others were simply too afraid to speak up. Additional individuals were of course implicated, apprehended, and interrogated in Salem town by former local magistrates John Hawthorne, Jonathan Corwin, and Bartholomew Gedney, who had assumed the role of judges in the court of Oyer and Termini. Roger Toothaker, the suspect, passed away while incarcerated on the 16th of June, 1692, chalking up another victim of the witch hunt. Now, between June 30 and the early days of July, grand juries approved indictments against Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor, Martha Carrier, Sarah Wilds, and Dorcas Hoare. Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds, together with Rebecca Nurse, underwent a trial during this period, in which they were, yes, convicted. The execution of all 5 women took place on the 19th of July, 1692, by means of hanging. In mid-July, the constable in Andover extended an invitation to the afflicted girls from Salem village to meet with his wife in order to ascertain the source of her problems. Anne Foster, her daughter Mary Lacey, and granddaughter Mary Lacey Jr., all admitted to practicing witchcraft. Anthony Checkley was selected by Governor Phillips to succeed Thomas Newton as the Crown's attorney, after Newton accepted a position in New Hampshire. In September of the same year, 1692, an additional 18 individuals were indicted by grand juries. William Proctor, who was re-arrested on fresh allegations, was not indicted by the grand jury. Giles Corey, on September 19, 1692, chose not to enter a plea at his trial, and as a result, he was subjected to peine forte et dure, a method of torture where the individual is gradually crushed under the progressively heavier weight of stones, with the intention of forcing them to give information. 4 individuals admitted their culpability, while 11 others were subjected to a trial and were convicted. But of course, we can't just skip past Giles Corey just like that. You see, something rather remarkable happened during his execution. Of course, the more weight that was added, the more people expected that he would cry out for mercy and give up the information or beg for them to stop. But he didn't. He simply endured it, more and more weight, without making a single sound. And apparently, the last words of Giles Corey, when it knelt down to him and said, "Don't you want mercy? Say something." Apparently he had replied, "More weight." Now that's a pretty badass way to go, isn't it? Well, rest in peace to Giles Corey. Very brave in the face of death and torture. Certainly not easy. Now, in a letter dated September 20, Cotton Mather requested Stephen Sewell to provide him with a detailed account of the evidence presented during the trials of 6 or 12 of the main witches who had been found guilty. Mather expressed his desire to be better equipped to combat the evil forces, and what better way of doing that than having written documents of how other people had combated them. You're going to start somewhere, don't you? Well, on September 22nd, 1692, a further 8 individuals were put to death. After the execution, Mr. Noyes, facing the bodies, expressed his sorrow at witnessing the sight of 8 individuals who were considered wicked, and they were all condemned to hell. Dorcas Hoare was granted a temporary respite, with the endorsement of multiple ministers to provide a confession of practicing witchcraft. Mary Bradbury, who was 77 years old, successfully fled with the assistance of her relatives and acquaintances. Good for her, I suppose. Abigail Faulkner Sr. was pregnant at the time and granted a brief postponement. According to some sources at the time, Abigail's postponement later turned into a suspension of charges. Now, Mather expeditiously concluded his narrative of the trials, titled Wonders of the Invisible World, and it was presented to Governor Phipps upon his return from the conflict in Maine in early October. It's asserted that both Phipps' letter and Mather's manuscript were likely sent to London on the same ship in mid-October, and this is a line from the letter from Governor Phipps, dated October 12, 1692, in Boston. I hereby declare that as soon as I came from fighting and understood what danger some of their innocent subjects might be exposed to, if the evidence of the afflicted persons only did prevail either to the committing or trying of any of them, I did, before any application was made unto me about it, put a stop to the proceedings of the court, and they are now stopped till their Majesty's pleasure be known. End of the letter from Governor Phipps. Well, October 29th, some few weeks later, Judge Sewell stated that the court of Oyer and Termine considered themselves dismissed. When questioned if the court of Oyer and Termine should continue, the governor expressed concerns about potential inconvenience and stated that it simply must be disbanded. Now, coincidentally, the wife of Governor Phipps, Lady Mary Phipps, was one of the individuals who had been summoned during this period. But following Phipps' directive, all executions ceased. Now, the Superior Court of Judicature, the Court of Assize, and General Jail Delivery, led by William Stoughton as Chief Justice, reconvened in Salem, Essex County, in January of 1693. Anthony Checkley remained the Attorney General, and Jonathan Elletson served as the clerk of the court. The initial 5 trials conducted in January of 1693 involved individuals who had been formally accused, but had not yet undergone trial in September, waiting around in those dirty rat holes of their cells. It's no wonder people die in those terrible places. And you must remember, too, this was in the winter months, all the way through January. No heating. Ugh. Not good at all on those cold stone floors. I'm sure they gave them some hay to lie on. Well, the individuals who were on the chopping block in September were Sarah Buckley, Margaret Jacobs, Rebecca Jacobs, Mary Whiteridge, and Job Tukey. All individuals were acquitted, however. Lucky for them. Grand juries were convened for the individuals who were still incarcerated, while charges were dropped against several other individuals. An additional 16 persons were formally accused and subjected to trial, resulting in the conviction of 3 individuals, being Sarah Wardwell, Mary Post, and Elizabeth Johnson, Jr. Upon receiving the warrants for the execution of these 3 individuals and others who were still awaiting trial from the previous court, Governor Phipps granted pardons, so saving their lives. I'm sure he's got their vote. Well, at the latter part of January or February, the court reconvened at Charlestown, located in Middlesex County. During the session, grand juries were convened, and 5 individuals were put on trial, that being Sarah Cole from Lynn, Lydia Dustin and Sarah Dustin, Mary Taylor, and Mary Toothaker. Although all individuals were acquitted, they were not released until they settled their incarceration expenses. Unfortunately for Lydia Dustin, she passed away while incarcerated on the 10th of March, 1693. In late April, the court assembled in Boston, Suffolk County, and exonerated Captain John Alden through a proclamation. The court received allegations against a domestic worker, Mary Watkins, for making false accusations of witchcraft on her employer. Last time she makes her work overtime. Well, in May, the court assembled in Ipswich, Essex County, and conducted multiple grand jury proceedings. All charges against everyone, except for 5 individuals, were completely dropped. Susanna Post, Eunice Fry, Mary Bridges, Jr., Mary Barker, Jr., and William Barker, Jr. were acquitted through trial, therefore concluding the sequence of legal proceedings and capital punishments. Upon determining that a loss, disease, or death was attributed to witchcraft, the individual who made this conclusion proceeded to file a formal accusation against the suspected witch with the magistrates in the area. If the accusation was considered credible, the magistrates would apprehend the individual and bring them in for a public examination, which essentially involved the magistrates interrogating the accused in order to elicit a confession. A lot of the time, of course, it's leading questions. Could you imagine? Yes or no answers only. Have you stopped talking to the devil? You can only answer yes or no. You answer yes, so you have been talking to the devil. You answer no, so you're still talking to the devil. Perhaps not exactly like that. But leading questions, you don't get away with that in a modern courtroom. Now, if the local magistrates were convinced that a complaint was actually valid, they would transfer the suspect, or prisoner at this point, to a higher court for further action. In 1692, the magistrates chose to postpone action until the new charter and governor arrived. The new governor would establish a court of oyer and terminer to address these matters. Subsequently, the next course of action at the higher court level involved summoning witnesses to appear before a grand jury. An individual may face indictment for practicing witchcraft, or even entering into an illicit pact with the devil. Upon being formally charged, the accused individual proceeded to a legal proceeding, often occurring immediately, as exemplified by the initial person charged and tried on June 2nd, Bridget Bishop, who was put to death only 8 days later, June 10th, 1692. There were a total of 4 execution dates during the Salem Witch Trials. On June the 10th, 1692, 1 person was executed. On July 19th, 1692, 5 were executed, that being Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Good, and Sarah Wilds. Another 5 individuals were executed on August 19th, including Martha Carter, John Willard, George Burroughs, George Jacobs Sr., and John Proctor. Lastly, on September 22nd, 1692, 8 individuals were executed, namely Mary Easterly, Martha Corey, Anne Pudieter, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Redd, and Margaret Scott. Several other individuals, namely Elizabeth Bassett Proctor and Abigail Faulkner, were found guilty, but were granted short reprieves due to their pregnancies. 5 other women were found guilty in 1692, but the execution of the death penalty was simply never carried out. Perhaps a little bit of introspection was applied. These women are Mary Bradbury in absentia, Anne Foster, who later died while in prison, Mary Lacey Sr., the daughter of Foster, Dorcas Hoare, and Abigail Hobbs. Now, a little bit more about Giles Corey. I want to talk about him in a little greater detail. Well, he was an octogenarian farmer residing in the southeastern region of Salem, known as Salem Farms. And of course, we've mentioned his defiance by refusing to enter a plea during his trial in September. The judges employed an antiquated method of punishment known as the peine forte de jour, when stones were stacked against his chest until he was unable to breathe. Well, Corey died without entering a plea after enduring 2 days of torture. The historian Chadwick Hansen argues that the reason for Corey's refusal to plead is often attributed to his desire to protect his estate from being taken by the crown. However, he also points out that a significant portion of Corey's property had already been confiscated, and Corey had even made a will while in prison. Therefore, Corey's death can be seen as a kind of form of protest against the court's methods. Now, it's also been stated by another modern critic, Robert Calof, that Giles Corey declared his innocence to the charges against him, but refused to be tried by a jury, as they had not acquitted anyone during the trials, sort of going on trends and not wanting to be up against it. Corey was aware that the same witnesses would testify against him, and therefore opted to endure whatever form of death they would oppose upon him. Now, Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, who were both found guilty, were expelled from their churches and deprived of appropriate funerals. Immediately after the bodies of the accused were removed from the trees, they were swiftly placed into a shallow grave, and the crowd scattered. According to oral tradition, the deceased's families allegedly retrieved their bodies during nighttime and interred them in unmarked graves located in their own land. The historical records of the era unfortunately don't document the fatalities of any individuals who were executed. Now, a significant portion, although not all, mind you, of the evidence presented against the defendant consisted of spectral evidence. Now, what is this? Well, it mainly refers to the testimony of the afflicted individuals who asserted that they witnessed the appearance or form of the person who was believed to be causing them harm. The theological controversy that followed regarding the utilization of this evidence revolved around the question of whether an individual needed to grant consent to the devil for their form to be employed in causing harm. Now, opponents argued that the devil had the ability to manifest in the form of any person to harm others, kind of like shape-shifting, putting on a mask, an impostor. However, the court maintained that the devil could not assume someone's appearance without their consent. Consequently, when the afflicted individuals claimed to witness the apparition of a particular person, it was considered as proof that the accused had willingly invited the devil in for a collaboration of sorts. While the primary objective of Cotton Mather's The Wonders of the Invisible World was to demonstrate the meticulousness with which the court handled the trials. Regrettably, the dissemination of the work occurred only after the conclusion of the trials, but Mather elucidated his book that he considered spectral evidence to be conjectural and insufficient on its own to justify a conviction. Certainly inclined to agree with him. Well, Robert Califf, a vehement detractor of Cotton Mather, asserted in his own publication titled More Wonders of the Invisible World, certainly got the one-up on him on that one, didn't he? That individuals accused of witchcraft, such as Tituba and Dorcas Good, may avoid standing trial by simply confessing. It's a bold strategy. See how far that gets you. Well, in a letter titled The Return of Several Ministers Consulted, Increase Mather and the other clergy members implored the court to refrain from convicting individuals based on only spectral evidence. Now, the court then determined that spectral evidence was not permissible, leading to a significant decrease in the number of convictions and potentially expediting the conclusion of the cases. A duplicate of this letter was included in Increase Mather's Cases of Conscience, which was published in 1693. The magistrates at Salem referred to the publication A Trial of Witches, which pertained to the 1662 Bury St. Edmund's witch trial, in order to find a precedent for admitting spectral evidence. Due to the endorsement of the esteemed philosopher, physician, and author Thomas Brown, as well as the jurist Sir Matthew Hale, the evidence in question was allowed in the Bury St. Edmund's witch trial and the trials of 2 women from Lowscroft. The colonial magistrates also acknowledged the credibility of this evidence and proceeded with the trials. In the records of the Salem Village Church, there is a March 27, 1692 record by Paris, stating that Mary Sibley, who was a church member and lived near Reverend rather, instructed John Indian, a man who was owned by Paris, to prepare a kind of witch cake. Well, this action could have been a superstitious endeavor to repel malevolent entities. based on an account ascribed to Deodat Lawson. This event took place approximately on March the 8th, which was more than a week after the initial grievances were reported, and 3 ladies were apprehended. According to Lawson's description, the cake was considered a method to uncover witchcraft. It was constructed with rye, meal, and urine from the affected girls, and it was given to a dog. Paris recounts in the church records that on March 25th, 1692, he had a private conversation with Sibley regarding her grave mistake, and acknowledged her regretful admission. Following the primary sermon on March 27th, once the larger group of worshippers had been departed, Paris specifically spoke to the members of the church who had made formal commitment, cautioning the entire congregation against seeking assistance from the devil to combat the devil. You see, he claimed that the calamities in his household did not become widely known until satanic methods were employed, specifically the baking of a cake by his Indian servant, who had received instructions from Mary Sibley. This contradicts, however, Lawson's report, which places a date around March the 8th. Either way, the initial grievances were reported on February 29th, and the initial apprehensions took place on March the 1st. Well, according to tradition, it is reported that the girls were believed to be affected by the situation were entertained by Tituba, who was a slave owned by Paris. According to many secondary accounts, including Charles W. Upham in the 19th century, it is commonly reported that a group of girls assisted by Tituba attempted to practice fortune-telling. They used the albumen of an old egg and a reflective surface to fashion a rudimentary crystal sphere for the purpose of telling the future and telling the occupants their prospective life partners. Which sounds like something that a bunch of teenage girls would do on a sleepover. Set up a little crystal ball and say, "Oh, wow, you're going to marry Zac Efron." I don't know. Someone like that. Maybe Timothy Chalamet in this day and age. Showing my age a little bit. Well, however, their endeavor took a disconcerting turn when one individual purportedly perceived an apparition of a coffin instead of a dashing husband. Now that's not something you want to see. This narrative, whether it be true or not, is derived from John Hale's book on the trials, where he recounts that only one of the girls, rather than a collective, admitted to him afterwards that she had done all of this. But Hale made no mention of the involvement of Tituba in the incident, nor did he specify the exact time it occurred. However, the transcript of Tituba's preliminary interrogation reveals her providing a vigorous admission, addressing the court about, I quote, entities that reside in the imperceptible realm and the sinister ceremonies that unite them in the service of Satan. She implicates that both Good, that being Sarah Good, and Osborne, while asserting that numerous individuals in the colony were involved in the diabolical plot. Well, later versions frequently depict Tituba's race as either Caribbean, Indian, or perhaps African, while contemporary sources simply refer to her as Indian. Elaine Breslau's research indicates that Tituba may have been taken captive in present-day Venezuela and then transported to Barbados, potentially making her an Arawak Indian. While in subsequent accounts, including in Governor Thomas Hutchinson's historical writings on the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the 18th century, he characterizes her as a Spanish Indian. Now, on to the actual trials themselves. Well, we talk about something called the touch test, which relied on the belief in effluvia, which gained notoriety for its application during the preliminary tests in Andover in September of 1692. Paris had cautioned his audience about engaging in such inspections. Observers inferred that if the accused witch made physical contact with the victim during a fit, and the fit subsequently ceased, it was considered that the accused was responsible for afflicting the victim. According to the testimonies of numerous individuals who were later accused, this is the quote from their writings. "We were blindfolded, and our hands were laid upon the afflicted persons, they being in their fits and falling into their fits at our coming into their presence, as they said. Some led us and laid our hands upon them, and then they said they were well, and that we were guilty of afflicting them, whereupon we were all seized as prisoners, by a warrant from the justice of the peace, and forthwith carried to Salem town." The Reverend John Hale provided an explanation for this phenomenon. I quote, "The witch, through the power of her gaze, releases a harmful poison into the bewitched individual, causing them to experience a fit. Consequently, when the bewitched individual touches the witch's hand, the poison is transferred back into the witch's body through a sympathetic connection." Additional evidence comprised the admissions of the defendants, statements made by a self-proclaimed witch who implicated others as witches, the finding of dolls, books on divination and astrology, or containers of ointments in the possession or residence of the defendants, and the observance of protuberances on the body of the accused known as witches' teats. A witch's teat refers to the mole or imperfection on the body that lacks sensitivity to touch, something that was put there by the devil as kind of a mark of ownership. The identification of these insensitive regions was seen as undeniable proof of witchcraft. Of course, we talk about things like the pricking test. You would have a little needle, and every tiny little blemish on the body would be pricked to see if it bled. Of course, you can imagine how this would be, one, humiliating to be stripped naked first, and two, very painful to have every little freckle, every little mark pricked. Well, that's just one of the methods that they used. Of course, the trial held great attention for Puritan preachers throughout the Massachusetts colony, and a number of individuals journeyed to Salem to gain a little bit of information on the trial. These ministers put forward their diverse perspectives in writing somewhat afterwards. In November of 1692, Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather, simultaneously finished writing Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits and Wonders, and published it. The purpose of this book was to carefully recognize the increasing skepticism towards spectral evidence, while ensuring the fidelity of Cotton's revised and sanitized text. Similar to his son, Increase limited his direct participation, but he did publish a complete text of his August plea to Salem court in favor of spectral evidence. Based on the apologetic tone of the Cases of Conscience, it can be inferred that the moral panic had certainly diminished. Thomas Brattle even publicly mocked the superstitions of Salem, and openly criticized Increase's defense of his son in a letter that was characterized by its mocking tone. Well, despite the conclusion of the last trial in May of 1693, the public's reaction to the events persisted. After the trials, survivors, family members, and their advocates made efforts to prove the innocence of the condemned individuals and obtain compensation. In subsequent generations, the progeny of individuals who were unfairly accused and convicted have endeavored to commemorate their legacies. Events held in Salem and Danvers in 1992 were utilized to memorize these trials. And in 1936, the city of Salem acquired the land in the region and changed its name to Witch Memorial Land. However, no memorial was built on the location, and a widespread misunderstanding about it all continued to exist until January 2016, when the University of Virginia disclosed that its project team had identified the specific location on Gallows Hill in Salem, where 19 individuals accused of witchcraft were publicly executed. In 2017, the city took ownership of the property and established the Proctor's Ledge Memorial to honor the victims. Matthew Hopkins, often referred to as the Witchfinder General, a notorious figure in 17th century England, infamous for his roles in the witch hunts that swept through East Anglia during the English Civil War. Starting in the year 1644, Hopkins, with no official title or public office, appointed himself as a hunter of witches, capitalizing on the chaotic social and religious climate of the time. His methods, which included coerced confessions, led to the execution of an estimated 300 women, making him responsible for more witch trials than any individual in England before or since. Despite his brief career, which ended with his retirement in 1647 and his passing away a year later, Hopkins' legacy remains a chilling reminder of the dangers of fanaticism and persecution. Hello and welcome to the channel. Are you new here? If you are, it's good to meet you. And if you're coming back, thank you for returning to the party. As always, if you like what I do and would like to support the channel, links to the Patreon are in the description. And if you want to help YouTube push the video out to more people, like, comment and subscribe certainly helps push them in the right direction. Now, without further ado, please make yourself relaxed, and we may begin. Now first, I will give a brief biography of Matthew Hopkins, talk about the situation during the English Civil War, and later on we will read directly from his writings a question and answer style format that he had developed. So, let us now begin. Matthew Hopkins, whose early life remains largely undocumented, was born in Great Wenham, Suffolk County, England. He emerged as the fourth of 6 children to James Hopkins, a Puritan clergyman who served as the vicar of St. John's of Great Wenham. The Hopkins family was somewhat prominent, holding titles to lands near Framlingham Castle. The parishioners held James in high regard. Evidence from a bequest in 1619 intended to purchase Bibles for his 3 children at the time, suggesting Matthew was born after this year. By the time Matthew began his infamous career, he was probably no older than 28, and possibly as young as 25, given his birth post-1619 and his death in 1647. His father passed away in 1634, but the parish continued to reflect his influence when William Dowsing, an iconoclast working under the orders of the parliamentarian Earl of Manchester during the English Civil War, visited in 1645, he noted the absence of idolatrous monuments in the parish. Hopkins moved to Manningtree, Essex, around the early 1640s, marked the beginning of his notorious career. He invested an inheritance of 100 marks to purchase the Thorn Inn in Mistley, positioning himself as a gentleman. While Hopkins later portrayed himself as experienced in witch hunting through his writings, notably in his book The Discovery of Witches, 1647, which we will read from shortly, he claimed to have gained this knowledge without having extensively travelled. Despite suggestions of legal training from his conduct within trials, there is very little evidence supporting this, and the little evidence that does support it is somewhat circumstantial. His brother, John, became a minister in South Fambridge in 1645, but he was removed in 1646 for neglecting his duties. This further complicated the family's reputation during this chaotic period. Now, following the events of the Lancaster Witch Trials of 612 to 634, an important shift occurred in the treatment and perception of witchcraft in England. William Harvey, physician to King Charles I, had been tasked with examining 4 women accused during these trials, leading to a significant change in legal procedure concerning witchcraft accusations. From Harvey's involvement, there emerged a requirement for material proof of witchcraft, specifically evidence that an accused individual had formed a covenant with the devil, rather than merely committing acts of the maleficum, or malicious witchcraft. Under this new scrutiny, witches were categorized as heretics against Christianity, which was deemed their most grievous offense. This classification brought witchcraft under the umbrella of Crimean exceptum, with continental and Roman law, and that meant that it was considered so heinous that normal legal protocols could be overridden. So effectively, if you were accused of witchcraft, you no longer had any legal rights. Since the devil would not confess, confessions had to be extracted from the accused humans themselves, often by any means necessary. Well, the witch hunts led by Hopkins and John Stern primarily took place in East Anglia, covering Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk, and Cambridgeshire, with some activities extending to Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. Their operations coincided with the English Civil War, and were concentrated in areas with strong Puritan and parliamentarian influence, which were key components of the Eastern Association from 1644 to 47. Hopkins started his career officially in the March of 1644, after overhearing a conversation reportedly about demonic dealings in the nearby hamlet of Manningtree. Although the initial accusations were made by Stern, Hopkins quickly became involved as his assistant. Their first major trial took place in Chelmsford in 1645, where 23 women were tried. 19 were convicted and hanged, while another 4 died in prison. Do note that not a single one of them was found innocent. Now, it is important to note as well that during this period, and outside Middlesex and chartered towns, there are no records of anyone being sentenced to death for witchcraft other than by assize judges. Hopkins and Stern, along with women who performed the pricking test, travelled across England and, claiming Parliament had officially commissioned them to expose and prosecute witches. Now, no doubt when I just mentioned the pricking test, a few eyebrows raised. Well, what exactly is witch pricking? You see, it stemmed from the belief that after dealings with the devil, one would receive a mark on their body that was unable to feel pain or bleed. It was kind of like a receipt or a mark that the devil had left behind to show he was there and mark his territory. Kind of like that. So, witch prickers would have this set of needles that they would poke into the skin of suspects, trying to find which one of the marks on their bodies was the old receipt from the devil. Now, one can only imagine that if the suspect had a lot of freckles or just a few little sunspots, which many people did since people worked outside back then, how long this ordeal would take. Reportedly, the witch prickers were very thorough, which led to, most of the time, it was so painful that people would simply confess. False confessions, of course. Of course, they didn't see this as torture. They just saw this as a test. Well, of course, we know nowadays that confessions under torture are not very valid, but back in those days, a confession was a confession. Of course, don't worry. The Witchfinders are the good guys. They said so, right? Well, let's continue on. You know that they received substantial payments for their services. This wasn't a charity job at all. No, this was a proper business. Indeed, capitalizing on people's fear and being called out to a village to get rid of a witch, well, of course, that had expenses. And the more the hysteria spread, the more profitable this became. Well, this all, of course, has led a lot of historians to suggest a financial gain as a motivation. It very well could be. Hopkins himself declared that his fees covered the upkeep of his company, which included 3 horses, and he charged towns 20 shillings each. The financial burden on local communities was, of course, considerable. Stowmarket was charged £23, equivalent to about £4,000 in 2021, which is, I think, around $4,500 US. My conversion maths is not so good. Plus travel expenses, of course. Now, this might not sound like too much, but you have to remember that these are small villages filled with peasants, ran by peasants, and perhaps a somewhat underqualified bishop, local priest. Of course, when you have someone come from the big city, it's very easy to trust everything they tell you, especially when it's for your own safety and for your own good. So that's what Mr. Hopkins was very good at doing. Now, the impact of their activities was profound enough that Ipswich, which is a very large city in modern times, had to levy a special tax in 1645 to cover the costs. The activities of Hopkins and his team were well known to Parliament, by the way, and as evidenced by reports and concerns raised during the Bury St. Edmunds trials in 1645. A report to Parliament highlighted suspicions that some had resorted to dubious methods to extract confessions. Of course, you get paid for how many witches you find. If you show up to the town and there's no witches there, well, I suppose you don't really get any money for that, don't you? So it's in the best interest to make sure you get as many as you can to make the trip worthwhile. Now, the subsequent trial and executions were also met with quite a lot of discomfort and criticism, notably in an editorial from the parliamentary paper, the Moderate Intelligencer, which reflected unease with the conduct and outcomes of these witch trials. So do not think that everybody was whipped up in the frenzy. Whether it be the common people, the middle class, or even indeed the people in Parliament, there were quite a few people who were willing to ask questions about the methods and techniques, and even the whole institution of having witch hunters. Well, the techniques that Matthew Hopkins employed in his witch-hunting pursuits drew heavily from a text authored by King James I, called Demonology, and I'll have a large video on that quite soon, which Hopkins referenced in his own publication, The Discovery of the Witches. Despite torture being officially illegal in England, Hopkins engaged in coercive methods, such as sleep deprivation to force confessions from those he accused. So basically they would put you in a room and keep you up for so long whenever you'd go to doze off, they'd find some way to wake you up. Now, I get quite cranky when I haven't had my afternoon nap, so I would admit to anything just so I can get that extra 10 minutes beyond the snooze button. Additionally, he utilized a method where he would attempt to cut the arm of the accused with a blunt knife, believing that if the individual did not bleed, it indicated witchcraft. And here's another controversial method employed by Hopkins that you might know about: the swimming test, premised on the belief that witches, having renounced their baptism, would be rejected by water. The accused were tied up onto a chair and submerged in water. Floating was considered proof of witchcraft. They'd be dunked in the water and out of the water until the desired result was achieved. However, due to legal and ethical concerns, Hopkins was cautioned against using this method without the consent of the accused, leading to its official discontinuation by late 1645. Now, of course, we mentioned the consent of the accused. Now this was one of those punishments that was, yes, very unpleasant, but if you started sinking in the water, it was pretty obvious to everybody around that you were innocent. So a lot of people simply said, "Throw me in the lake. See if I sink or swim. I'll prove you wrong." So there was perhaps a little bit of Hopkins that was saying, well, perhaps it's better that we get rid of this test, even though it could be easily rigged. Now, Hopkins and his associates also searched for the devil's mark on the body of the accused, which was purportedly an insensible spot that did not bleed or could perhaps be a mole, a birthmark, or even an extra nipple. This mark was believed to be where the witch's familiar, and that's an animal like a cat or a dog, perhaps a bird, something like that, would suckle blood from the witch, kind of like a baby nursing on its mother. In cases where no visible mark was found, the witch prickers came in, and they were employed to slowly probe the bodies with needles, often after the accused had been completely shaven to uncover any hidden marks. That includes the head and everywhere else, by the way. This very invasive procedure was part of a broader set of practices that reflected the intense witch hunt fervor of the time, all driven by this unique blend of fear, superstition, religious zealotry, and a little bit of capitalism on the side. As Hopkins' witch-hunting activities intensified, resistance began to grow, particularly from John Gall, the vicar of Great Staunton in Huntingdonshire. Gall was motivated to oppose Hopkins after caring for a woman from St. Neots who had been imprisoned on charges of witchcraft, awaiting Hopkins' examination. Upon discovering that Hopkins was inquiring about his reception in the area, Gall took action by publishing a critical work titled Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcrafts in 1646, which he dedicated to Colonel Walton of the House of Commons. Additionally, Gall embarked on a series of Sunday sermons aiming at curbing the fervor for witch hunting. So you see, this wasn't always just the full support of the church. Don't think that all of the Christians and all of that were out there trying to hunt down witches, because the people being accused, they were Christians too. And don't think that Christianity is the only one who executes people for apparent witchcraft, because that is a global phenomenon that continues into the modern day. Look at Africa, by the way. And of course, well, this man, this Gall, had certainly become the arch nemesis of Matthew Hopkins, certainly getting in the way of business, it seems. In Norfolk, the legitimacy of Hopkins and his associate John Stern's methods came under further scrutiny by the justices of the Assize. They were questioned about the ethicality of their torture techniques, and also the rather large fees that they charged for their services. Accusations were made, fingers were pointed, and they suggested that Hopkins' investigative methods might classify him and his followers as witches themselves. Pulling out the Uno reverse card on them, it seems. Questions also arose about whether Hopkins possessed undisclosed knowledge or had resorted to unlawful courses of torture in his pursuit of alleged witches. By 1647, as the judicial sessions resumed, both Hopkins and Stern had withdrawn from witch hunting, with Hopkins retiring to Manningtree and Stern to Bury St. Edmunds. This withdrawal marked a significant retreat in the face of growing legal and public opposition to their controversial methods and the ethical implications of their witch hunt practices. Well, Matthew Hopkins' influence on witch hunting extended beyond England's borders, outlined in his 1647 publication, The Discovery of Witches. His methods, detailed in this book, which we'll read from a little later, were adopted and recommended in various law books, significantly impacting witch trials in the New England colonies. The first recorded witchcraft execution in New England was Alice Young of Windsor, Connecticut, who was hanged on the 26th of May, 1647. Shortly after, Margaret Jones was tried and executed using evidence collected from techniques described by Hopkins, such as searching and watching, as noted in the journal of Governor John Winthrop. The execution of Margaret Jones, the first person to be executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts, marked the beginning of a sustained period of witch trials in New England that lasted from 1648 to 1663. And just a quick note on Margaret Jones. We actually have some case files from the trial itself, a little journal that was kept by John Winthrop, the Massachusetts governor at the time. The trial of Margaret Jones was notable for its reliance on watching, and this is what is detailed in Governor Winthrop's journal. He recorded in his journal during his vigil that he kept watching over her, an imp, kind of like a little demon, believed to be a witch's familiar, appeared in broad daylight, which was used as key evidence in her conviction. Now let's read from Winthrop's journal now. June 15th, 1648. At this court, one Margaret Jones of Charlestown was indicted and found guilty of witchcraft, and hanged for it. The evidence against her was 1. That she was found to have such a malignant touch as many persons, men, women, and children, whom she stroked or touched with any affection or displeasure or etc., were taken with deafness, vomiting, or other violent pains and sickness. 2. She practicing physic, and her medicines being such things as, by her own confession, were harmless, as anise seed, liquors, etc., yet had extraordinarily violent effects. 3. She would use to tell such as would not make use of her physic, that they would never be healed, and accordingly their diseases and hurts continued, with relapse against the ordinary course, and beyond the apprehension of all physicians and surgeons. 4. Some things which she foretold came to pass accordingly. Other things she would tell of, add secret speeches, etc., which she had no ordinary means to come to the knowledge of. 5. She had, upon search, an apparent teat as fresh as it had been newly sucked, and after it had been scanned, upon a forced search, that was withered, and another began on the opposite side. 6. In the prison, In the clear daylight there was seen in her arms, she sitting on the floor and her clothes up, etc., a little child, which ran from her into another room, and the officer following it, it was vanished. The like child was seen in 2 other places to which she had relation, and one maid that saw it fell sick upon it, and was cured by the said Margaret, who used means to be employed to that end. Her behaviour at the trial was very intemperate, lying notoriously, and railing upon the jury and witnesses. And in the like distemper she died. The same day and hour she was executed. There was a very great tempest at Connecticut, which blew down many trees, etc. End of the passage from John Winthrop's journal. Thus Margaret was executed on June 15th, 1648. Years later, some of Hopkins' interrogation and trial methods resurfaced during the infamous Salem Witch Trials in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. These trials saw 19 individuals executed for witchcraft, with Giles Corey notably being pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea, and over 150 others imprisoned. Now, pressed to death, I'll quickly explain. Generally, there would be a board placed on top of you, and stones or other heavy objects would be added, slowly increasing the weight until you would be crushed. Very slowly. Not a good way to go. You end up looking like a little pancake. Now, the lasting impact of Hopkins' techniques on the American colonies highlights the profound and chilling reach of his witch-hunting legacy. He passed away at his residence in Manningtree, Essex, on the 12th of August, 1647, likely from pleural tuberculosis. He was swiftly buried within hours of his demise in the graveyard of St. Mary's Church on Mistley Heath. The legacy of Hopkins, as historian Malcolm Gaskell notes, continues to pervade that of an anti-hero and boogeyman, with his image remaining highly adaptable and eternally insubstantial. A pleasing legend regarding Hopkins' death also emerged, suggesting that he was subjected to his own infamous swimming test and executed as a witch. However, this tale is widely dispelled by the parish registry at Mistley, which confirms his actual bury there. Now, we know about the life and death. What about the works? Well, you see, we are lucky in a somewhat macabre way to have the text of the Discovery of the Witches for us all to enjoy. But before I read it, please do keep in mind that the language is a little old, and in order to remain faithful to the primary text, I'm not going to change it into a more modernized English. I think you should get the gist of it just fine. Let's take it slow. The Discovery of Witches, in answer to several queries lately delivered to the judges of Assize for the county of Norfolk, and now published by Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder, for the benefit of the whole kingdom. Exodus 22:18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Certain queries answered, which have been and are likely to be objected against Matthew Hopkins in his way of finding witches. Query 1. That he must needs to be the greatest witch, sorcerer, and wizard himself, else he could not do it. Answer. If Satan's kingdom be divided against itself, how shall it stand? Query 2. If he never went so far as is before mentioned, yet for certain he met with the devil and cheated him of his book, wherein were written all the witches' names in England, and if he looks on any witch, he can tell by her countenance what she is. So by this, his help is from the devil. Answer. If he had been too hard for the devil and got his book, it had been to his great condemnation, and no disgrace at all. And for my judgment in physiognomy, he hath no more than any man else whatsoever. Query 3. From whence proceedeth this his skill? Was it from his profound learning, or from much reading of learned authors concerning the subject? Answer. From neither of both, but from experience, which, though it may be meanly esteemed of, yet the surest and safest way to judge by. Query 4. I pray, where was this experience gained, and why gained by him, and not by others? Answer. The discoverer never travelled far from it, but in March 1644 he had some 7 or 8 of that horrible sect of witches living in the town where he lived, a town in Essex called Manningtree, with divers and other adjacent witches of other towns, who every 6 weeks in the night, always on the Friday night, had their meeting close by to his house, and had their several solemn sacrifices there offered to the devil, one of which this discoverer heard speaking to her imps one night, and bid them to go to another witch, who was thereupon apprehended and searched by women who had for many years known the devil's marks, and found to have 3 teats about her, which honest women have not. So, upon command from the justice, they were to keep her from sleep for 2 or 3 nights, expecting that in time to see her familiars, which the 4th night she called in by their several names, and told them what shapes, a quarter of an hour before they came in, there being 10 of us in the room. The first she called was 1. Holt, who came in like a white kitling. 2. Jamara, who came in like a fat spaniel without any legs at all. She said she kept him fat, for she clapped her hand on the belly, and he sucked good blood from her body. 3. Vinegar Tom, who was like a long-legged greyhound, with the head of an ox, with a long tail and broad eyes, who when this discoverer spoke to, and bade him go to the place provided for him and his angels, immediately transformed himself into the shape of a child of 4 years old, without a head, and gave 6 turns about the house, and vanished at the door. 4. Sack and sugar, like a black rabbit. 5. Newes, like a polecat. All these vanished away in a little time. Immediately after this witch confessed several other witches, from whom she had her imps, and named to divers women where their marks were, the number of their marks, and imps' names, as Elamaser, Piowacket, Pekin the Crown, grisel, and greedigut, which no mortal could invent. And upon their searches the same marks were found, the same number, and in the same place, and the like confessions from them of the same imps, though they knew not that we were told before, and so peached one another thereabouts, and joined together in the like damnable practice that in our 100 in Essex. 29 were condemned at once, 4 brought 25. Miles to be hanged, where this discoverer lives, for sending the devil like a bear to kill him in his garden. So by seeing divers of the men's paps, and trying ways with hundreds of them, he gained this experience, and for aught he knows any man else may find them as well as he and his company, if they had the same skill and experience. Query 5. Many poor people are condemned for having a pap or teat about them, whereas many people are and have been a long time troubled with natural rets on several parts of their bodies, and other natural things as hemorrhoids, piles, childbearing, etc. And these shall be judged only by one man alone and a woman, and so accused or acquitted. Answer. The parties so judging can justify their skill to any, and shew good reasons why such marks are not merely natural, neither that they can happen by such natural cause as is before expressed, and for further answer for their private judgments alone, it is most false and untrue. For never was any man tried by search of his body, but commonly a dozen of the ablest men in the parish or elsewhere were present, and most commonly as many ancient skilful matrons and midwives present when the women are tried, which marks not only he and his company attest to be very suspicious, but all beholders, the skilfullest of them, do not approve of them, but likewise assent that such tokens cannot in their judgments proceed from any the above-mentioned causes. Query 6. It is a thing impossible for any or woman to judge rightly on such marks. They are so near to natural, and they have that they find them, durst not presently give oath that they were drawn by evil spirits, till they have used unlawful courses of torture to make them say anything for ease and quiet, as who would not do? But I would know the reasons he speaks of, how and whereby to discover the one from the other, and so be satisfied in that. Answer. The reasons in brief are 3, which for the present he judges to differ from the natural marks, which are: 1. He judgeth by the unusualness of the place where he findeth the deeds in, or on their bodies being fair distant from any usual place, from whence such natural marks proceed, as if a witch plead the marks found are emerods. If I find them on the bottom of the backbone, shall I assent with him, knowing that they are not near that vein, and so others by childbearing, when it may be they are in the contrary part? 2. They are the most commonly insensible, and feel neither pin, needle, awl, etc. thrust through them. 3. The often variations and mutations of these marks into several forms confirms the matter, as if a witch hear a month or two before that the witchfinder, as they call him, is coming, they will and have put out their imps to others to suckle them, even to their own young and tender children. These upon search are found to have dry skinness and films only, and be close to the flesh, keep her 24 hours with a diligent eye, that none of her spirits come in any visible shape to suck her. The woman have seen the next day after her teats extended out to the former filling length, full of corruption, ready to burst, and leaving her alone then 1/4 of an hour, and let the women go up again, and she will have them drawn by her imps close again. Probatum est. Now for answer to their tortures in its due place. Query 7. How can it be, possibly, that the devil bring a spirit, and wants no nutriment or sustentation, should desire to suck any blood? And indeed, as he is a spirit, he cannot draw any such excrescences, having neither flesh nor bone, nor can be felt, etc. Answer. He seeks not their blood, as if he could not subsist without any nourishment, but he often repairs to them, and gets it, the more to aggravate the witch's damnation, and to put her in mind of her covenant. And, as he is a spirit and prince of the air, he appears to them in any shape whatsoever, which shape is occasioned by him through joining of condensed thickened air together, and many times doth assume shapes of many creatures, but to create anything he cannot do it. It is only proper to God. But in this case of drawing out these teats, he doth really enter into the body, real, corporeal, substantial creature, and forceth that creature, he working on it, and in it, to his desired ends, and useth the organs of that body to speak withal to make his compact up with the witches, be the creature cat, rat, mouse, etc. Query 8. When these paps are fully discovered, yet that will not serve sufficiently to convict them, but they must be tortured and kept from sleep for 2 or 3 nights to distract them, and make them say anything, which is a way to tame a wild colt, or a hawk, etc. Answer. In the infancy of this discovery it was only not thought fitting, but enjoined in Essex and Suffolk by the magistrates, with this intention only, because they kept being awake, would more the active to call their imps in open view than sooner to their help, which oftentimes have so happened, and never or seldom did any witch ever complain in the time of their keeping for want of rest, but after they had beat their heads together in the gall. And after this use was not allowed of any of the judges and other magistrates, it was never since used, which is 1.5 years since. Neither were any kept from sleep by any order of direction since. But peradventure their own stubborn wills did not let them sleep, though tendered and offered to them. Query 9. Beside that unreasonable watching, they were extraordinarily walked till their feet were blistered, and so forced through that cruelty to confess? Answer. It was in the same beginning of this discovery, and the meaning of walking of them at the highest extent of cruelty was only then they walk about themselves the night that they were watched, only to keep them walking. And the reason was this: when they did lie or sit in a chair, if they did offer to couch down, then the watchers only desire to sit up and walk about, for indeed when they be suffered so to couch, immediately comes their familiars into the room, and scareth the watchers, and hardeneth on the witch, though, contrary to the true meaning of the same instructions, diverse had been the rustical people, they hearing them to confess to the witches, misused, spoiled, and abused, diverse whereof have suffered for the same, but could never be proved against the discoverer to have a hand in it, or consent to it, and hath likewise been unused by him and others, ever since the time they were kept from sleep. Query 10. But there hath been abominable, inhumane, and unmerciful trial of all these poor creatures, by tying them and heaving them into water, a trial not allowable by law or conscience, and I would fain know the reasons for that. Answer. It is not denied, but many were so served as had paps and floated. Others that had none were tried with them and sunk. But mark the reasons. For first, the devil's policy is great in persuading many to come for their own accord to be tried, persuading them their marks are so close they shall not be found out, so as divers have come 10 or 12 miles to be searched for their own accord, and hanged for their labour, as one Meggs, a baker, did, who lived within 7 miles of Norwich, and was hanged at Norwich assizes for witchcraft. Then, when they found that the devil tells them false, and they reflect on him, and he, as 40 have confessed, adviseth them to be sworn, and tells them that they shall sink and be cleared that way, then, when they be tried that way and float, they see the devil deceives them again, and have so laid open his treacheries. 2. It was never brought in against any of them at their trials as any evidence. 3. King James in his Demonology saith, it is a certain rule, for, saith he, witches deny their baptism when they convent with the devil, water being the sole element thereof, and therefore, saith he, when they be heaved into the water refuseth to receive of them, they being such miscreants to deny their baptism, and suffers them to float as the froath on the sea, which the water will not receive, but casts it up and down till it comes to the earthly element on the shore, and there leaves it to consume. 4. Observe these generation of witches. If they be at any time abused by being called thieves, whores, etc., by anywhere they live, they are the readiest to cry, and writhing their hands and shed tears in abundance, and run with full and right sorrowful acclamations to some justice of the peace, and with many tears make their complaints. But now behold their stupidity, nature or the elements' reflection from them, when they are accused for this horrible and damnable sin of witchcraft. They never alter or change their countenances, nor do they let one tear fall. This, by the way, swimming by able divines whom I reverence, is condemned for no way, and therefore of late hath and for ever shall be left. Query 11. Oh, but if this torturing witch-catcher can by all or any of these means wring out a word or two of confession from any of these stupefied, ignorant, unintelligible, poor, silly creatures, though none hear it but himself, he will add and put her in fear to confess telling her, else she be hanged. But if she do, he will set her at liberty, and so put a word in her mouth, and may such a silly creature confess she knows not what. Answer. He is of a better conscience, and for your better understanding of him, he doth thus uncase himself to all, and declares what confessions, though made by a witch against herself, he allows not of, and doth altogether account of no validity, or worthy of credence to be given to it, and ever did so account it, and ever likewise shall. 1. He utterly denies that confession of a witch to be of any validity, when it is drawn from her by any torture or violence whatsoever, although after watching, walking, or swimming divers have suffered, yet peradventure magistrates with much care and diligence did solely fully examine them after the sleep, and consideration sufficient. 2. He utterly denies that confession of a witch, which is drawn from her by flattery, etc. If you will confess, you shall go home. You shall not go to jail, nor be hanged, etc. 3. He utterly denies that confession of a witch, when she confesses any improbability, impossibility, as flying in the air, riding on a broom, etc. 4. He utterly denies a confession of a witch, when it is interrogated to her, and the words are put into her mouth, to be of any force or effect as to say a silly, yet witch wicked enough. You have 4 imps, have you not? She answers affirmatively. Yes. Did they not suck you? Yes, saith she. Are their names so and so? Yes, saith she. Did you send such an imp to kill my child? Yes, saith she. This being all her confession after this matter, it is by him accompted nothing, and he earnestly doth desire that all magistrates and jurors would a little more than ever they did examine the witnesses about the interrogated confessions. Query 12. If all of these confessions be denied, I wonder what he will make confession, for sure it is. All these ways have been used and took for good confessions, and many have suffered for them, and I know not what he will then make confession. Answer. Yes, in brief he will declare what confession of a witch is of validity, and force his own judgment, to hang a witch. When a witch is first found with teats, then sequestered from her house, which is only to keep her old associates from her, and so by good counsel brought into a sad condition, by understanding of horribleness of her sin, and the judgments threatened against her, and knowing the devil's malice, subtle circumventions, is brought to remorse and sorrow for complying with Satan so long, and disobeying God's sacred commands, doth then desire to unfold her mind with much bitterness, and then without any of the before-mentioned hard usages or questions put to her, doth of her own accord declare what was the occasion of the devil's appearing to her, whether ignorance, pride, anger, malice was predominant over her. She doth then declare what speech they had, what likeness he was in, what voice he had, and familiars sent to her, what names they had of what number of spirits, what shapes they were in, what employment she sent them about to several persons in several places unbeknown to the hearers, all which mischiefs being proved to be done, at the same time she confessed to the same parties for the same cause, and all effected is testimony enough again for all her denial. Question 13. How can any possibly believe that the devil and the witch are joining together, should have such power, as the witches confess to kill such a man, child, horse, cow, the like, if we believe they can do what they will? Then we derogate from God's power, who for certain limits the devil and the witch, and I cannot believe they have any power at all. Answer. God suffers the devil many times to do much hurt, and the devil doth play many times the deluder and impostor with these witches, in persuading them that they are the cause of such and such a murder wrought by him with their consents, when, and indeed, neither he nor they had any hand in it. As thus, we must needs argue, he is of a long standing, above 6,000 years. Then he must needs be the best scholar in all knowledge of arts and tongues, and so have the best skills in physic, judgment, in physiognomy, and knowledge of what diseases reigning or predominant in this year or that man's body. And so for cattle, too, by reason of his long experience. This subtle temper, knowing such a man liable to some sudden disease, as by experience I have found, as pleurisy, imposthume, etc., he resorts to divers witches, if they know the man and seek to make a difference between the witches and the party. It may be by telling them he hath threatened to have them very shortly searched, and so hanged for witches. Then they all consult with Satan to save themselves, and Satan stands ready prepared, with a "What will you have me do for you, my dear and nearest children?" convenated and compacted with me in my hellish league, and sealed with your blood, my delicate, firebrand darlings. Oh, thou, say they, that at the first didst promise to save us thy servants from any out of deadly enemy's discovery, and didst promise to avenge and flay all of those we pleased that did offend us. Murther, that wretch, certainly who threatens the downfall of your loyal subjects. He then promiseth to effect it. Next news is heard the party is dead. He comes to the witch, and gets a word of reverence, credence, and respect for his power and activeness, when and indeed that disease kills the party, not the witch, nor the devil. Only the devil knew that such a disease was prominent, and the witch that aggravates her damnation by her familiarity and consent to the devil, and so comes likewise in compass of the laws. This is Satan's usual impostering and deluding, but not his constant course of proceeding, for he and the witch do mischief too much. But I would that the magistrates and jurors would a little examine witnesses when they hear witches confess such and such a murder, whether the party had not long time before, or at the time when the witch grew suspected, some disease or other predominant which might cause that issue or effect of death. Question 14. All that the witchfinder doth is to fleece the country of their money, and therefore rides and goes to towns to have employment, and promiseth them their fair promises, and it may be doth nothing for it, and possesseth many men, that they have so many wizards and so many witches in their towns, and so heartens them on to entertain him. Answer. You do him a great deal of wrong in every of these particulars, for first, he never went to any town or place, but they wrote, or sent often for him, and were, for aught he know, glad of him. He is a man that doth disclaim that ever he detected a witch, or said, Thou art a witch, only after her trial by search, and their own confession, he as others may judge. Lastly, judge how he fleeceth the country and enriches himself, by considering the vast sum he takes of every town. He demands but 20 per town, and doth sometimes ride 20 miles for that, hath no more than for all his charges thither and back again, and it may stays a week there, and find there 3 or 4 witches, if it be but one, cheap enough, and this is the great sum that he takes to maintain his company with 3 horses. End of the Project Gutenberg source for discovery of the witches. Well, isn't the English language beautiful? I certainly think it is. I would like to thank you for getting this far, and I would like to especially thank my top-tier Patreon subscribers, whatever we call them, patrons, I suppose. Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Susan. Thank you very much. And now that I have read for you the discovery of witches, don't go out and try and find any. You may be a little disappointed. Well, if you do find any, I think these days they're far more interested in selling you crystals and salt lamps and having you subscribe to their TikTok accounts. Witches just ain't what they used to be. Well, thank you very much again for listening. And until next time, I will wish you all the best. Good night, everyone.